Lyanna Stark is a specter that figuratively and perhaps literally haunts the narrative of A Song of Ice and Fire. Although she died long before the main storyline begins, her existence, her journey, and her death are presented as the catalysts for a great deal of the events that occur within the contemporary era. She's such a significant presence and driving force that it's actually shocking to realize that she isn't even mentioned by name 50 times throughout the entire series. But Lyanna's importance is much more symbolic than it is literal. She has an enormous impact not because of who she was as a person, but because of what she represents to the people who are still living now. And interestingly, there are some significant context clues hinting at the possibility that the characters whose lives were completely redefined by Lyanna's existence didn't know the real her at all. Although Lyanna Stark transformed the tapestry of Westeros, everything that the readers think that they know about her could be wrong. Despite having a short life, Lyanna Stark was fiercely loved by some. But the way that people feel about her, the way that they imagine her to be, and the way that they imagine the world to be if only she had lived, ultimately had a far greater impact than Lyanna herself did. In many respects, she is more of an imagined wish fulfillment in the eyes of those that she impacted. And even those left who were closest to her don't really see her as nothing more or less than the teenage girl that she was. Rhaegar Targaryen is obviously long gone by the time that A Song of Ice and Fire begins, but Lyanna's story is inextricably linked with his. And, although we can never know for certain what was going through his mind when he met Lyanna, he may be one of the clearest examples of how, even when Lyanna was still alive, she represented a wish fulfillment fantasy. Plenty of fans see Rhaegar and Lyanna as a straightforward tragic romance, which is understandable given that Game of Thrones made this theory a fact in their adaptation, and given that George R.R. Martin himself has described Rhaegar as love-struck when he met Lyanna. But I think that there's more to it than that. Obviously, Rhaegar barely knew Lyanna when he crowned her the Queen of Love and Beauty. And the notion that a man who was pretty notorious for being emotionally detached from the people around him fell madly and genuinely in love with a girl he met days ago doesn't really make sense narratively. And frankly, George R.R. Martin just doesn't typically write straight-out romance in this way. Even the supposedly healthiest relationships in A Song of Ice and Fire have some element of toxicity. So Rhaegar and Lyanna as an unambiguous love story has never really made sense. What I think is far more likely is that Rhaegar Targaryen simply saw Lyanna Stark as the ideal candidate to make his three-headed Targaryen dream come true. Rhaegar was obsessed with mimicking the original 3 Targaryen siblings, and he was obsessed with the Song of Ice and Fire. So, when it became obvious that Elia was not a viable option to bear another child, seeing a young, healthy, and pretty badass girl from the ancient House Stark, whose familial imagery was surrounded by ice in contrast to Targaryen fire, he probably thought that the gods had placed the answer to all of his problems directly into his path. But that doesn't mean that he was in love with Lyanna, even if he may have thought he was. Again, he didn't even know her well enough to decide whether or not he liked her, let alone was in love with her. And considering his single-minded focus on fulfilling prophecy, it seems extremely improbable that his sudden infatuation with Lyanna wasn't somehow related to that ultimate desire. Frankly, this possibility is arguably less disturbing than the idea of a married adult man with 2 children falling in love at first sight with a teenager. But it also makes sense. Rhaegar generally seems to lack deep personal relationships with anyone. So it doesn't seem likely that Lyanna was just so spectacular that he was instantly besotted with her because of a crush and not because he thought she could make all his dreams come true. Rhaegar was desperate to have a Visenya to complete his 3-headed dragon, and his fixation on Lyanna was likely just an extension of this obsession. And this is actually why I think that Lyanna was the exact opposite of everything that the people around her thought she was. Clearly, this is only a thematic contrast, but it seems relevant that Jon Snow was likely the end result of Rhaegar's attempt to create 3 Targaryen dragons who were destined to save the world. And yet Jon Snow defied every single one of Rhaegar's probable expectations. Rhaegar already had his Rhaenys and Aegon, And if he did truly believe that the prophecy was meant to be fulfilled by his children, and they would be some kind of OG Targaryen 3 reborn, then it seems safe to assume he wanted Lyanna to give him his Visenya, a warrior princess set to wed Aegon, the prince who was promised, and that his third child would possibly be the final piece of the puzzle to bring real dragons back into the world, save the world, and cement the Targaryen legacy as something greater than all else. Rhaegar would have probably imagined that his child with Lyanna would be an apex Targaryen, and yet, absolutely everything about Jon is exactly what Rhaegar would not have expected. He was a boy, he was every inch a Stark, he had a bastard's name, he bonded with a direwolf, and most importantly, his conception nearly destroyed Westeros and led to the collapse of House Targaryen rather than leading them to their ultimate glory. If Rhaegar had any love for Lyanna, it was likely love for the part that she could play in his fantasy. And given George R. R. Martin's thematic focus on characteristics like physical appearance and familial resemblance, I have a hard time believing that Jon being as un-Targaryen as humanly possible doesn't say something about Jon, and by extension Lyanna. But Rhaegar is hardly the only one who uses Lyanna as the girl who could have made all of his fantasies come true. Obviously, Robert Baratheon is the opposite side of that same coin when it comes to Lyanna, and I think that there are likely a lot of parallels between the way in which Rhaegar and Robert saw Lyanna Stark. We get a much clearer insight into Robert's thoughts and feelings about Lyanna, both through his own statements and through the eyes of Ned. We know for a fact that Lyanna is the symbol of everything Robert has ever wanted but couldn't have, and his imagined love for Lyanna has absolutely nothing to do with Lyanna herself. Robert and Ned's relationship is actually one of the most interesting elements of the story that we don't get nearly enough objective insight into. We know that they're the best of friends. They grew up together and their lives in the Eyrie with Jon Arryn were incredibly formative for the adult men they became. But they certainly don't come across as individually compatible people, which makes their bizarre, toxic enmeshment with one another even more strange. Lyanna is clearly the symbolic centerpiece of that enmeshment, and the so-called love that they seem to share for her feels more like a wistful longing for their own shared childhood innocence. They also both seem to use her as an unconscious excuse for their near-complete lack of emotional development in the time since the rebellion. When it comes to Robert's feelings about Lyanna specifically, it's interesting because she's entirely a fantasy to him. In his mind, she was the love of his life, the woman who was perfect for him, but he basically didn't even know her. So that makes his obsessive fixation on her even more meaningful. Clearly, the image of Lyanna that exists in his mind exists for a reason, and it's worth asking why. After Lyanna's death, what she's meant to symbolize to Robert is easier to interpret. Essentially, she's a character in his personal narrative who plays whatever role that Robert needs her to, and oftentimes, more importantly, she is there to excuse Robert's failings as a husband, father, and king. His supposed passion for her explains away Robert's willingness to tear the country apart to get her back, or to assassinate a pregnant young girl for having the Targaryen surname. Realistically, we know that if Robert's fantasy about marrying Lyanna had come true, he would have still been every bit the drinker and womanizer that he was now. Sure, he may have avoided the trauma of war, and Lyanna probably would have been easier to cope with than Cersei, because who wouldn't be? But long before the rebellion even began, both Lyanna and Ned acknowledged that Robert was who he was, and Lyanna wasn't going to change that. Much of Robert's adulthood fixation on Lyanna revolves around something relatable and painfully mundane. He is nostalgic for his past, he fantasizes about how good things could have been for him if only the circumstances had been right, and he uses Lyanna's death as a convenient excuse for all of his greatest failings as a person. And from that point of view, Robert's feelings that are focused around Lyanna make sense. All of his hopes, dreams, disappointments, failures, and personal traumas are wrapped up in his internal image of Lyanna Stark. But an image is all that is. What's more interesting, though, is that the mythology of Lyanna clearly had to have been building up in Robert's mind before she had even died. Robert's rebellion itself is a really fascinating component of A Song of Ice and Fire, because fundamentally, it was not Robert's rebellion. Jon Arryn was really the driving force behind the decision to disobey Aerys Targaryen. And it was the bonds between Jon, Robert, and Ned that fueled the overthrow of House Targaryen. And yet, the public narrative is, and apparently always has been, that Robert was so ferociously in love with Lyanna that he went to war to win her back from Rhaegar. Clearly, there is an element of the victors writing the history here, but this version of events is pretty distinctly built into the bedrock of Westerosi lore, and it doesn't seem like there was ever any competing narrative regarding what actually fueled Robert's rebellion. Obviously, there is an easy love story fantasy that this kind of mythology can be built on. But Robert did fight intensely to get Lyanna back, and it's clear that Ned and Robert both sincerely believe that this is the truth. Ned specifically thinks, within his own mind, that Robert loved Lyanna even more than he did. And again, Robert sees his entire life story through the lens of losing Lyanna. But again, we know that Robert's point of view can't be true, because he barely knew the real Lyanna. So what was the driving force behind Robert's passion for Lyanna before she actually died? I'd love to believe that the vengeful spirit of Argella Baratheon took over her bloodline and decided to end the Targaryens once and for all. But the reality is probably much simpler. The Baratheons in general are quite fond of fighting. And as Robert says himself, "I swear to you, I was never so alive as when I was winning this throne, or so dead as now that I've won it." So, despite Robert framing Lyanna's death as the worst thing that's ever happened to him, he never felt better than when he was at war supposedly trying to save her. And there's probably some good old-fashioned sexism at play here too, as the big badass Robert Baratheon losing his betrothed to another man would not be a good look. Ergo, what Robert thinks of as ferocious passion for Lyanna was really just fury at his intensely wounded pride. Ironically, Lyanna Stark will undoubtedly become a legendary figure in history specifically because of Robert Baratheon, and Robert's recollections of her and fantasies about her will paint her as a Helen of Troy-level dream girl. However, Lyanna won't ever be remembered for the person she was, because Robert Baratheon never truly knew her. The fandom's image of Lyanna is understandably built around Ned Stark's point of view, as he is the POV character who knew her the best, and the majority of what we know about Lyanna's story is conveyed through his eyes. But I think that relying on Ned's memory of Lyanna is a mistake, because he can be an unreliable narrator, because so much of his trauma is also wrapped up in the image of Lyanna, and because frankly, he probably didn't know her nearly as well as he thought he did either. Yes, Ned and Lyanna were siblings, and yes, Ned's love for Lyanna was undeniably real. However, Ned and Lyanna spent many of their formative years apart, and by the time war breaks out, their familiarity with each other had greatly diminished. One particular passage feels particularly relevant here. In A Game of Thrones, Ned 10, Ned recalls this memory. "No," Ned said with sadness in his voice. "Now it ends." As they came together in a rush of steel and shadow, he could hear Lyanna screaming. "Eddard," she called. A storm of rose petals blew across a blood-streaked sky, as blue as the eyes of death. "Lord Eddard," Lyanna called again. "I promise," he whispered. "Leah, I promise." Now, it's entirely possible that Ned is just misremembering what happened here, but there's a detail that really jumps out. Ned is once again thinking of his promise to Lyanna, and he thinks about her calling out to him from the Tower of Joy. And he remembers her calling him Eddard, and then Lord Eddard. If this is true, then it's incredibly strange, because Lyanna called him by a name so formal that even those who don't know Ned normally don't use it. Ned is Ned to everyone, so if Lyanna was calling him Lord Eddard when they were finally reunited, it sounds like the gulf between Ned and Lyanna had grown far larger than Ned himself realized. And I think there are other signs that Ned's image of Lyanna may not have been true to who Lyanna was or what she went through. For instance, one key moment in Ned's internal narrative is often pointed to as proof that Lyanna and Rhaegar were truly in love. Ned wonders if Rhaegar had frequented brothels. Somehow he thought not, which is seen as an indication of Rhaegar's good character. That's certainly a valid interpretation, but it's not the only interpretation. Because frankly, Ned is extremely resistant to seeing horrors that are right in front of his face, and it's probably much easier and more comforting to believe that his sister didn't suffer when she was with Rhaegar. This seems like a plausible interpretation because we actually see Ned use Lyanna to avoid something that might be traumatic or difficult to deal with when it comes to Robert. Ned is appalled at Robert's dismissal of the murder of the Targaryen children, but the loss of Lyanna is supposedly what pulls them back together. He then repeats this pattern when he reunites with Robert in a Game of Thrones. So when Robert makes decisions that should theoretically break down his relationship with Ned, Ned uses Lyanna as a constant excuse to turn a blind eye to the person that Robert has become, and who he also may have always been. He comforts himself with an illusion so he can tell himself that things aren't as bad as they really are. Ned habitually does this with more than just Robert as well. A Game of Thrones is basically a non-stop barrage of Ned Stark being confronted with obvious red flags, and then ignoring those red flags because he doesn't want them to exist. And if he's so unreliable that he can't even be trusted to perceive the reality that's in front of him as it's happening, assuming that his memories and visions of Lyanna are some kind of objective truth is obviously a mistake. Yes, Ned had a relationship with Lyanna, and he certainly knew her better than any POV character that we meet in A Song of Ice and Fire. But he had spent years apart from her, and if we assume that Lyanna actually took off with Rhaegar willingly for some reason and Ned just didn't know, it's clear that his connection to her wasn't nearly as deep as he thought it was. Sadly, Lyanna was likely more of an avatar for his emotional enmeshment with Robert Baratheon, rather than a fully formed person in Ned's own mind, too. And ultimately, that is the likely story of Lyanna on the whole. She didn't even live long enough to become the person she would have been had she made it to adulthood, and her life would eventually be defined by, and probably destroyed by, the people who saw what they wanted to see in her and built her up to be this fantasy woman rather than seeing her as the girl that she was. But what do you think? Does the legend of Lyanna Stark likely match up to the reality? Leave your comments and opinions below, and if you're interested in more content like this, like and subscribe.